All right, everybody, welcome to this week's show. I've got an interview coming up in just a little bit that I'm super excited about, but first, I want to let you know this week's show is a little different. It's a special show. It's what I'm going to call a heart-to-heart show. Now, as you know, on a typical week, I go to great measures to keep you entertained. I'll use trendy music. I'll throw a picture of like koalas up on the screen. Those are koalas, right? Or sound effects. But today I want to strip all of that away, and I just want to have a heart-to-heart. Don't worry, all that'll be back next week, but for today, just a heart-to-heart about this topic, when self-help doesn't help. And I just want to acknowledge that for some people watching, you know, our tips about sleeping better, eating better, exercising better, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, that's good. That's all good and well. It may marginally improve your life a little bit, but it barely scratches the surface of the pain you're in and what you're feeling and experiencing right now. And you're discovering that self-help doesn't help in your case. Well, I want to share my story in these few minutes we have together. No cool music, no anything else, just my story. And hopefully just share that you're not alone, that a lot of people find that self-help doesn't help, that it's not enough, and they need to reach out to someone to help them shoulder the load, to walk alongside with them. And I just want to start with that idea that you're not alone. The latest stats I saw said 40 million Americans suffer from anxiety disorders. That's almost 1 in 5 of us who are adults. And so I know the number of people who watch this show. That means there's a good number of people watching right now that have an anxiety disorder. And if it's not you, then statistically speaking, it's your mom or dad, your brother or sister, son or daughter, friend or coworker, someone in your close orbit of relationships is struggling right now and needs you to understand what anxiety is all about. And I can tell you firsthand, it is rough. I was listening to Pastor Max Lucado just recently, and he said that anxiety comes from the Latin word which means to squeeze, and it's like it squeezes the breath out of us. It squeezes so much out of us. It squeezes our sleep out, our energy, our passion. It squeezes the very life out of us. And I say us because, again, I'm someone who struggled with anxiety, and this is my story. So my story will start maybe 10 years ago when all of my worst fears came true all at once. It happened right here on my neck, a little pink bump that was like any other bump I'd had. The difference was this one kept growing and growing and didn't stop until it became the size of a golf ball or bigger. And I knew I had to go to the doctor. I hated the doctor. I'd been afraid of doctors my entire life, afraid of needles and procedures and that whole world. And yet I had to go to the doctor. And wouldn't you know, they threw the highest powered antibiotics they had at it, and nothing scratched the surface. This thing just kept growing. And it turned out I had an antibiotic-resistant infection, probably MRSA. It was terrifying because by definition, almost all antibiotics would not work against it. And the doctor, when he saw what was happening, he said, I'm going to call the hospital and they're going to be waiting for you and you need to go right now. You know, don't pass go, don't collect $100, don't even stop for lunch, just get to the hospital. They'll be waiting for you. And I won't bore you with the rest of the story. Obviously, I'm okay today. But the part of the story I want to share today is that in the midst of that, I felt like I was losing my mind. And this simmering anxiety I had felt since I was a little kid suddenly boiled over to where it wasn't manageable anymore and where I knew I needed help or I just wasn't going to make it through that season of life. And so I reached out to a pastor friend and I just said, hey, I feel like I'm losing it here. What should I do? Well, he met with me and talked with me, but he knew that I needed professional help. And he knew just the right person to send me to, a Christian psychologist. And what a blessing that was. I remember driving to that very first appointment. It was about a 25-minute drive. and I saw a rainbow on the way, and I just felt God's presence, even in the drive up to counseling. Like I was really taking a first step at taking care of myself. And it wasn't all, kittens and rainbows, though. I cried in that first session, and I just told this psychologist, I told her, listen, I majored in psychology. I studied counseling at a master's level. Like, I know what you're going to tell me. I don't think there's any hope for me. I've tried all the stuff you're going to tell me to do. I've already tried it. And look at me, I'm a wreck. And I just said, but I got to do something. And so here I am. So let's try something. And we entered into, I don't know, maybe it was 2 years of meeting, more frequently at first and less frequently later on, and untangling all that was going on in my mind. Like I said earlier, she became someone to walk alongside me and to listen to me, to let me know that I wasn't alone and what I was experiencing wasn't, out of the typical human experience, but I wasn't losing my mind. But she helped me, first of all, by asking me to see a psychiatrist who is in the same office with her. A psychiatrist is different than a psychologist in that they are a medical doctor. They've been to medical school and done all of that. And their specialty is helping treat mental illness with medicine. And so this psychiatrist I saw started me on an SSRI, which is a type of antidepressant, which is also helpful for people with anxiety. And it functioned to help get the gears in my brain greased up a little bit so that I could engage in the process of therapy, so that I could start to make progress. And the goal was for me to learn things, new ways of thinking, new ways of behaving that I could apply after we stopped the medication. But we started that medication. The psychiatrist was also brilliant because she was able to zero in on precisely what was wrong. And getting the right diagnosis, in my case, was just critical to getting the right treatment. And what she said was, I didn't have hypochondria, I didn't have a phobia of doctors, I didn't have generalized anxiety. I had something very specific called OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Specifically, I had obsessions about medical problems, about the symptoms that I might feel in my body. Once I sensed something might be wrong with any part of my body, my brain latched onto that thought and immediately spiraled it down within 0.5 seconds to the worst possible outcome of what this could be. And, it may in reality only be a 0.00001% chance that this horrible outcome is going to happen. But the way my brain locked onto it and obsessed over it, it became what was going to happen. It was reality. It was definitely going to happen. And the compulsion part of OCD for me was, asking my mom, my wife, my whoever for reassurance. Hey, look at this. Is this what I think it is? And that would tamp down the obsession for a while, but it would come back and I would do the compulsion. Anyway, all that to say, knowing the correct diagnosis opened up the world of the cure to me. I found out that my brain functioned differently than most people's brain, objectively. Scientifically speaking, if you look at it on a medical scan, you'll see that my orbital complex is like lighting up like a Christmas tree. And it makes it hard for the gears of my brain to move smoothly on to the next thing. But I also learned that there are things I could do, just changing the way I think, that would change the way my brain would light up on that same scan, that would change the neural pathways, that would change my brain chemistry and physiology. And so I was very excited to give that a try. They told me to read several great books. The best one was called Brain Lock, and it gave me a concrete strategy for when those intrusive thoughts, those obsessions entered. The very first second it entered my brain, the strategy was to, relabel that as, hey, that is an obsessive thought. That is, I'm going to reattribute that to my OCD. And then I'm going to refocus my thoughts somewhere else. And eventually I'm going to revalue it. I'm going to devalue it and just know that thought is nothing to worry about. Well, let me tell you, it worked. I thought going into counseling, there's no chance this will work for me. It worked for me. It made a profound difference in my life. And I just want to share that story, that it's nothing scary, it's nothing weird, it's nothing to be ashamed about either. The statistics say that only 40% of people with an anxiety disorder get professional help. And that's because they're afraid of the stigma. This video is my effort to contribute something to the idea there should be no stigma. There should be no stigma around reaching out for help. If you need help, get help. There's nothing to be ashamed of. It's not that you're not a strong person. It's not that you're not a strong Christian. It's not that you don't have enough faith. It's no moral failing. It's just, hey, for whatever reason, your past experiences, trauma you've suffered, the way your brain chemistry works, for any variety of reasons, you are where you are. And God doesn't want you to live in this breathless kind of way with the joy and the sleep and the rest and the peace of your life being stolen away by some mental illness. God doesn't want that. And so I want to encourage you today, if self-help isn't helping, don't delay. Take action to make your life better. One of the tools God has given us, I think, is this understanding of how our body works, how our mind works, how the brain works, and these professionals who can help walk you through the process of progressing toward health and wholeness. And, that's what our interview is about today. I'm going to introduce you right now to a counselor named Ron Needham. He's a great guy. He's going to come to us from Colorado, where he founded his own counseling center and works there now. But he was also a great teacher. He actually taught me pastoral counseling during my master's degree at Calvin Theological Seminary. He's written books. He just released his second book. I could go on and on about this great guy, but I want you to meet him right now as we have a great conversation together. One of the best things you taught us in seminary was how the best counselors empty themselves and seek to really understand the experiences of the person who's seeking counsel. So the walking alongside them, helping them detangle their own thoughts, helping them find their own solutions that are just there, not imposing upon them something, but walking with them.
I'm smiling as you say this. The word in the Greek is kenosis, and students years ago would kind of play with me, and everybody had T-shirts that said "Got kenosis" on them. And this idea is first in that passage in Philippians. It's attributed to Jesus, that he emptied himself and took on the form of human beings because he was God. Because that's what God is like. God empties God's self to be with us. Well, just as Jesus allowed all that vulnerability, sometimes we're called to do the same thing. And in our pastoral work as counselors, we are asked to empty ourselves of our opinions and listen carefully to the life experience of somebody else. And if you come with an agenda that you're going to do something, it's already in trouble, because we have to listen first before we understand what wisdom would look like. And that listening skill means that we put our stuff out of the way, and we don't think about the stuff that bothers us or the challenges that we may face personally. But listening involves that kind of emptying. And another way to say it is, one of the real tools of good counseling is curiosity. And my favorite question, Bill, to ask anybody is, what is it like to be you? And after I ask that question, I always kind of shut up and listen as carefully as I can. And that's the conversation. What is it like to be you, whatever the situation may be?
I think that's one of the key takeaways from your class and your successor, Dr. Gibson, as well, that listening itself is healing, the process of being heard, being unconditionally accepted, so to speak, this unconditional positive regard, this relationship, where it kind of normalizes your experience. A lot of people think, man, no one else has ever gone through what I'm going through. This experience I'm having on the inside is totally unacceptable and abnormal. And just the thought of unpacking that before another human being and not being looked at like you've got, a billion eyes, like you're an alien, it's healing.
The process of the relationship is healing. Just as our relationship with God matters so much, the process of developing that relationship, the relationship is the tool for the healing process. And you can't short circuit that and get the results that you need in terms of helping people see themselves in a different way and being stronger in terms of their own sense of self.
Right.
So the process itself of conversation, and doesn't that mirror what we do when we pray? That is to say, doesn't that mirror facilitating our relationship with God? I mean, both have to happen in a useful way so that we are comfortable enough to say, yeah, this is the real me and these are the changes I need to make.
Yeah, well said. And you point out it's really important for that relationship to work. How does someone go about finding a good fit? How do you reach out for help?
It's always difficult to find a good referral. That's what we call them. And the advice I usually give is that I say to people, why don't you start, if you're in a certain community, start with the pastors in town and find out where they are sending people, because they always are making referrals, and find out where they're finding more effective kind of pastoral care for these people. So that's where I start. It's hard to start, Bill, with the yellow pages, you know? And so having conversations with other people who may have made use of people, or having conversations with pastors who do those referrals, that's usually been my method of operation.
And it's worth noting that, telehealth is a real thing now. And you can,
Counseling has become, I've got about a dozen clients and I'm seeing them all online. And I think that even after the quarantine subsides, there's going to be a much greater interest in telehealth because it is so efficient. And I think I'm pretty comfortable with it, but especially if I can see people in person, first of all. Now, with the quarantine, that's not possible. But in the best of circumstances, we need to be able to have that face-to-face conversation. We can build on it, but we got to start with it.
right. And you kind of alluded that there are different levels of help, so to speak, or different types of help. Pastoral counseling has a place and a role, and there's a role for counselors and therapists, psychologists, and there's also a role for psychiatrists and medical doctors who have the ability to prescribe medications. There's a role for family specialists, for relational specialists. There's a role for group therapy sometimes. Maybe talk a little bit about those, and especially the way medicine might be a part of someone's journey.
Well, as far as medications go, a lot of times people have another kind of resistance to taking certain medications. That's really unfortunate because, for example, the many antidepressant medications that are working really have a biological base. That is to say, if you're low on serotonin in your brain, you need a little help to get to a normal level. It's no different than if you're a diabetic person and you need insulin in order to keep your blood levels correct. So especially around both anxiety and depression, there may be the possibility of a biological piece to the problem. And if you make believe that's not the case, then you don't put all the 2x4s under people that you could use. So medications can be a real gift from God, and they would be used in conjunction with the kind of counseling that we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And so a both and is a wise way to look at the question of medication. Psychiatrists are the ones who do the best job prescribing, but they are so difficult to find and locate in our day. They don't even return our calls because they're so busy. General health practitioners, physicians can also make prescriptions of different kind of medications for both anxiety and depression, but they're not as schooled in it, they're not as trained in it, and often they don't give a sufficient amount because the local physician is going to be cautious.
Right.
So the psychiatrist is the best way to go, but often unavailable.
Right. And then the family physician is another good place to start if you want to know how to start your journey if you have a good working relationship with your primary care physician.
Our agency has several psychiatrists that we work with, and they often make referrals in our direction for the therapy side of dealing with some personal challenge. But medication should be seen as a possible asset for people who will be struggling either with anxiety or depression.
Yeah, I think it's because God created us physically, mentally, emotionally, socially. All of that plays together, even our spirituality. So it has to be a multidisciplinary approach if you want to take care of the full person, right? And we can't overlook the spiritual part. That's why church is important, pastors are important. Considering forgiveness is important. Considering your relationship with God and prayer and meditation is important as well. But unfortunately, there's some folks who would say that's all you need. You shouldn't have to go to a psychologist. You shouldn't have to use a medicine because God is enough. And what do you say to that person who kind of totally says psychology as a discipline is not needed if you have a correct relationship with God?
Well, I'll tell you this, the story that comes to mind. You can cut this out if you need to. The story that comes to mind is everybody knows it. It's about a flood where everybody's on the roof of the house, and the helicopter comes by, or the boat comes by, then the helicopter comes by, and the person says, well, God's going to help me. I don't need your help. God's going to help me. I don't need your help. Until the flood gets larger and larger. God sends us all kinds of blessings to back us up. And sometimes we have struggles that we can look at psychologically as well as spiritually. And I think it is probably the right word is probably a little bit simplistic to think that just having enough faith is going to suffice. And let me add to that. Sometimes, Bill, the problem is the relationship with God. And people ask that question why a lot, the question of theodicy, of why could God allow such a horrible thing to happen? Sometimes the conversation moves in that direction, and people who offer counseling should certainly be comfortable with that conversation.
Hmm. It's a interesting interplay between faith and the inner life. And man, I'm so glad that you have taken the time to join us today, and I'm so glad that you're offering your services. Even after you've retired from teaching, you're still in it. You're still writing, you're still counseling, and your teaching has been absolutely transformative for me in my life and a whole slew of other students too. So
thank you, Bill. It's so important to find meaning in your life, and this is one way for me and you to do it.
Oh, thank you. Well, thanks again for joining us. I really appreciate it. All right, I want to thank Professor Neidham again so much for taking the time to appear on this week's episode. And as we close, I want to close out my own story because, I kind of had the happy ending before, but there's a post-credits cliffhanger, there's this one more scene that I need to give you. And that is that anxiety is never fully just wrapped up with a bow on top and put away. Anxiety is a battle that you have to fight the rest of your life. In fact, it is a war. And I've found that if you let one of those, intrusive thoughts in to take root in your mind, it is not going to just work itself out or run its course, but it is going to go deeper and deeper until it owns all of you. And so anxiety is an ongoing effort, and I just want to be honest that it's flared up for me again recently. And that's the nature of anxiety. You have to keep fighting. And so I've kept fighting. I've been in touch with my doctor. I've been in touch with a counselor. I am doing everything I can to fight that battle. And I want you all to know that. Because the last thing I want you to do is watch these videos and think that my life is all Nerf battles and cooking competitions and playing tennis in the front yard. And for me and my wife, it's all smiles 24/7. The reality is I struggle just as much as the next person. And that's what it means to be human. We all struggle in various different ways, but we all have to keep fighting. The last thing I want to say is for someone out there who is fighting and you're fighting for your life, listen, suicide is the 10th leading cause of death in our country, and that is unfathomable to me on one level, and yet very fathomable on another level. And if you're watching today and even have a passing thought of harming yourself or someone else, I want to say, pause this video at this very instant. Don't go a second farther. Call 911 and get help right away. I'm also going to list some really helpful resources for everybody in the show notes in the video description below. There's a national suicide prevention hotline you can call. There's a crisis number you can text. And if you're not facing a full-on crisis right now, but you just need somebody to talk to, there's something called a warm line, and you can call that as well. Plus, I have resources down below where you can begin the process of finding a good fit for you and finding a counselor, therapist, psychologist, psychiatrist, etc. And finally, I have a resource for you that is kind of a test, a survey. If you're curious, hey, I don't know if I have a big problem with anxiety, or maybe what I'm feeling is just normal. You can take that online test and see how you score, and with regard to anxiety, depression, or a variety of other things, and then maybe see if taking some other step, like reaching out for help, is important. So listen, self-help. Believe it or not, I'm not a huge fan of self-help, but by nature, that's kind of what this video series is. Because that's true, God has given us these various ways, sleeping well, eating well, exercising well, thinking well, supporting ourselves well socially, that can make our lives better. And so this video series is by nature about all those ways God has given us to live life well. But also by the very nature of being human, self-help isn't enough. We're going to talk about the spiritual ramifications of that when we close the series in about 4 or 5 videos later. But today I want you to think about that even with regard to your mental health, and that sometimes self-help doesn't help. And if that's you today, take that next step. I guarantee you'll be glad you did. Okay, everybody, we'll see you back next week. We got some crazy things lined up. I guarantee it's going to be fun. And anyway, we'll see you then. Thanks for listening.